So welcome everyone. This is the ColumbusJS meetup. ColumbusJS meets every third Wednesday of the month. We used to meet in person, but now we're meeting live and direct on the internet. You can join the Zoom if you're here already. If you're not, go ahead and join us on the Zoom. You're welcome to. The link is in the meetup on meetup.com. Or you can watch us on Twitch at twitch.tv/ColumbusJS. And those are the two ways to consume the meeting. And if you miss those, we will be recording this as well, and I'll have it up on YouTube in a couple days. So tonight we've got Jordan Powell. He's going to be presenting on, well, I'll let him say what he's presenting on. It's I can't remember the exact title, but it's NgRx, NgRx. How do you say that properly, Jordan?
NgRx.
NgRx. So he's speaking on NgRx. And so while Jordan's presenting, if you have any questions and you're on the Zoom, just go ahead and you can just unmute and ask at a socially appropriate time. Don't talk over him, or you can leave it in chat on the Zoom, and I'll be watching those and I'll ask them on your behalf if Jordan doesn't see them, because he's got a lot to juggle already. And on Twitch as well, I will be looking for questions in chat. And so if you're watching on Twitch and you've got a question, go ahead and put it in there, and I'll make sure that Jordan sees it. I'll at the very least paste it in chat or try to ask it. So yeah, so that's the plan for this evening. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming out. Let's give Jordan a big welcome. Thanks for coming out.
Wow, that's a huge applause, guys. Thank you.
I know, right?
I appreciate that. We need like sound effects. Woo! Yeah, so thank you guys for the opportunity to present. Let's see, I should be able to share my screen. Or do you have to, let's see. Looks like you've disabled sharing my screen, guy. You're muted. I'm good now? Okay, perfect. Let's go. Sorry. You guys see my screen good? Perfect. So yeah, so today I want to talk a little bit about NgRx, and like Guy was mentioning, it's going to be super informal. So if you guys have questions, just let me know. My hope is that not to show you how smart or how much I know about something or don't know, but just hopefully I can present some new ideas, a new approach. I know several people mentioned that they're maybe new to Angular, and we're having we're wondering how to tackle certain problems. So I think that my goal would be to just present the case for NgRx for people that maybe not using it, or maybe you've never heard of it, or maybe you are using it. So yeah, just let me know if you guys have any questions along the way, and we'll go from there. So my talk it's really a best practices. It's not super technical, but more just like patterns, things to avoid, that sort of thing. So first question we want to ask is what is actually NgRx? And so NgRx is a framework for building reactive applications in Angular. It provides state management, isolation of side effects, entity collection management, router bindings, code generation, and developer tools that will enhance your experience as a developer when you're building different types of applications. So it's a framework, first and foremost. Second, it has a module called Store for managing state. It provides reactive state management for Angular apps, and it's inspired by REDUX. So those may be more familiar with REDUX or coming from a more famous or more commonly in the React world. It's basically Angular's implementation of Redux. And it basically is it unifies the events in your application and then drives state using RxJS. And then it has a module for isolating side effects in your application. So it gives you a framework for isolating the side effects in your app from your components and services and so forth. So the one thing I like about it is that it pushes all the side effects to the edge of your application and keeps as much of your application pure, easy to test, and then pushes the side effects to sort of the edge of your application. And then finally, it can help you unlock productivity because Angular has schematics. NgRx has schematics that also help you that are shipped with it that help kind of writing common boilerplate instead of, that way you can focus on the things that you care about, like actually building your application. So why would you use NgRx for state management? The big thing is that, like we mentioned, that NgRx provides state management for creating and you want to create, but you also want to be able to maintain your applications in an explicit way. And it does this by storing, and again, for those from are familiar with Redux, it's storing a single piece of state and then uses actions that get passed into reducers that basically express changes to that state. So one of the things that NgRx provides you is, I can never say this word right, serializability. It's quite a mouthful, but serializability. So what it does is it normalizes state changes and then you pass them through observables. So basically your NgRx will provide serializability and ensure that your state is it's stored predictably. And it will enable you to save the state to like an external storage, local storage, something like that. In addition, it also allows you to inspect, download, upload, dispatch actions, all from the Redux store DevTools, which I'll kind of get to a little bit more later. So obviously, one of the main benefits with Angular is that you get TypeScript and type safety out of the box. And so NgRx, it promotes type safety throughout the entire architecture. So you really get to rely on TypeScript's compiler. That way, or you feel confident that your program is correct. It provides encapsulation. So when you use NgRx, the effects or the store module, any interaction with external resources that have side effects, like if you're making a network request, like a WebSocket, or you have some sort of like business logic, those can be isolated completely from your UI. This isolation allows you to have a more pure and simple components, and it keeps it holds the single responsibility principle. So like I mentioned earlier, you're keeping your app very pure and then pushing those side effects to an outer like layer of your application, and it completely separates all the logic, isolates that from the UI. And then finally, one of my favorite things is that is testability. Because the store module in NgRx, it uses pure functions for changing state, selecting data from the state, and the ability to isolate the side effects from the UI. Testing is pretty straightforward. They also ship, NgRx ships some like helper test methods, like provide mock store and provide mock actions that will help isolate your tests and give you a better testing experience. And then finally, performance, because with it being Redux, NgRx actually takes advantage of memoization. So you can have a lot of state going in and out of your store, but because of the way it is built, and because of memoization, you can essentially, you have very quick, very fast performant state changes. So when should you actually like use NgRx for state management? And I think some of these will get at some of the things that Thomas was mentioning earlier, but the first being is NgRx on their website. They actually we have what they call the Sherry principle. So essentially these are kind of like, not necessarily like if you have this, you have to use NgRx, but these are like common problems that NgRx essentially tries to tackle. So shared. So like the first part is like, if you have state that is accessed by lots of components and services in your application, then NgRx is a good use case. Typically in Angular, you know, you have maybe a parent component, and then you have like child components that you then just input as like a prop into that component. And then if you have like an event or something that gets emitted that you need to say bubble back up to the parent, you just use inputs and outputs, which is works really well. The problem is that as your application grows, requirements change, things like that. You know, you become coupled to those things where, like we mentioned earlier, with NgRx, you essentially allow your components to be almost completely dumb and very pure. So essentially, it just becomes, your app becomes almost entirely components that are just subscribing to changes to data and displaying them and dispatching maybe some actions or things like that. If you have shared state throughout your app, that's a good use case. If you need state to be hydrated, so if you have state that needs to be persisted and rehydrated from an external storage, that would be a good use case. If you have state that needs to be available when re-entering routes, it's a good use case. So if you have NgRx has a module that actually hooks up to the Angular router. So say given like you go to, and I'll get into more specifics of how to implement this, but if your app can listen to a certain change of a route to a specific, maybe any route change or a route that has a specific URL or certain even query params on the route, it can dispatch very custom actions that then go get data. So that way you're not waiting for your component to initialize to then go get data. It can actually have data available for when you re-enter out. So you get some performance by doing it that way. Retrieve, so state that must be retrieved with the side effect. So if you're, pretty much every app that I know of, you're retrieving data from a API or, that's connected to a database or something like that. So that one really hits a lot of applications that I've worked on. And then finally impacted, so state that is impacted by actions from other sources. So again, these are not an exhaustive list and not a concrete set of lists, but these are just general like kind of flags that are like, okay, like if these problems your app does, and maybe your app does it and it can handle it, but sometimes if you spend a lot of your time fighting doing those things, NgRx might be a good way to kind of make your life easier. So here's actually like how it works. So NgRx And the Redux pattern in general uses indirection. So essentially, the store, which you'll see here, is basically it's the Redux store, which essentially it stores like a cache of the state of your application. So some of the main things, the key concepts are actions. So actions are essentially they can be described as unique events that are dispatched from components in service. So you may have a component that you click on a button, and then that, instead of that component like making the HTTP request through a service, that component would dispatch an action that says, hey, go get that stuff from, it doesn't even care where, it knows that when this button is clicked, it needs to dispatch this action. So think of actions as unique events that are dispatched throughout your application, throughout your app. You're then going to have state changes that are in this reducer. So these actions get passed into these reducers, and the reducers take the current state from the store, and essentially, based upon the action that's passed to it, it will then compute a new copy of that state. So in JavaScript, one of the main challenges you have is that we mentioned earlier, like it's very dynamic. So you're not, so it's easy to mutate state, which is good, but it's also bad. So what NgRx does is it forces you to use immutability. So everything in the store, anytime an action is passed in, the reducer will take the current state, and then whatever these reducers have functions in them that essentially describe how what the new instance of that state is going to look like, and then it stores that back into the store. Hope that makes sense. Then selectors are essentially there are also pure functions that they are used to select, drive, and compose pieces of the state. This is one of, I think, the most powerful parts of NgRx is the selector, is that you can essentially select, if you put all your state in the store, these selectors can you can compose them to do all kinds of things. Like for instance, a lot of people might be familiar with like a view model. Well, you can actually create a view model selector that essentially for every component or part of your application that would have a very custom selector, so that that component would have just one selector that selects an observable view model that essentially will subscribe to only those value changes that happen. And so you're not like managing, we've all been there where you have an API that you have to make a request to get like one thing, or you get back a list of, I don't know, like whatever, a big JSON object, but you only really care about like one or two things on it. Well, this, you may put all that into the store, but you're only selecting out of that the things that you care about. And then these come out as observables. So then you can subscribe to those value changes, and only the value changes on the things that you selected. So that's really the magic sauce of NgRx, in my opinion. And then we mentioned state, which is just an observable of the state as an observable of actions. So does that make sense so far, hopefully? So that is sort of the flow. So data is it's always one direction. We didn't really talk on effects. So effects are basically, you don't have to use them, but typically you will find yourself wanting to use them. Effects essentially, it's just like a normal service that you inject a stream of these actions into that, and then they listen for, you create these basically like methods in that service that listen for certain actions that then will then make a request. They handle all the side effects of your application. So typically it's going to make an API request to get data, something like that. And that's where you handle like, if you want to make sure you handle like 200s, like you get a good response back or you get a bad response. Like those are ways you can handle all the side effects of your app. As you can see, all of these parts are are pure and very testable. And then the side effects get pushed all the way out to the edge. So anything that breaks here, it's not really messing with the business logic or any of that in your application. So it's kind of the main benefit. So here is some best practices, and I'll try to breeze through these here, but basically when you import NgRx, you're going to, you can use what are called runtime checks. So here, like in the root of your project, like your app module, you would basically import the store module, and then you can essentially put these checks on here that are just additional runtime checks that basically keep you help you from doing bad things essentially. And so here's some examples like strict state immutability. So I mentioned earlier, like the number one rule in NgRx is immutability. So strict state immutability, that check verifies that you as the developer, as you try to modify the state object, it'll check that you're actually, not violating that rule. So as you can see, like here, you can see like if you in your reducer, if you tried to change this value by reassigning it to like an empty string, or like you're trying to push a new to-do on this list of to-dos, both of those mutate the state and violate the rule, and you'll actually get a runtime error. So it keeps you from running into that. So like how you do that with NgRx is essentially you would create a new copy of the state and then change those individual properties so that you get a completely new copy of the state, so you're not mutating it. We get strict action.
I have a question if you have a moment about that.
Yeah.
Is that a deep immutability? So if you have like a nested object, an object of objects, will that protect against changing those or not?
Yeah, and so I've ran into it before where I've ran into where it would throw an error and I was like, what in the world? But essentially like I would have like nested down in my store like a date that can't be serialized, and so it does a pretty good job of checking those. So, and again, these are just built in eventually like checks that help you as a developer. So here's like another this is the other one with strict state immutability or action immutability. So this is like, you can see instead of like passing an action, you're assigning it to like some method. That's a no-no. Strict state serializability. It's like the hardest word in the world to say, serializability. So here we have a violation of the rule where we see, I mentioned a second ago, like dates, like you need to stringify those dates so that they can be serialized. And then same with actions, they need to be serialized. So like you can't do like a console log because functions, any function can't be serialized. So like instead you would pass in, you would do it like this. So now we'll talk about creator functions, which some of you like the prior to NgRx version 8, it looked much more like someone, if you've used like Redux, it would look a lot similar to that, where you have actions that are essentially like enums, and then you have each action is just like a class that implements the action interface, where you would then pass in like properties if you wanted like additional, like a payload, or basically if your action needs to have some type of property that helps define the action that needs to take. And then you would then export these using type unions. Like this is how you would have to do it. And that's the kind of like general way you would do it with Redux. Well, with Angular NgRx version 8 and moving forward, they created action creators, which basically are factory functions. So it's a function that returns a function. So it is just a simpler, cleaner way of creating all the parts you need for NgRx. One of the big like things that everyone always talks about with NgRx is like, oh, it's a lot. There's a lot of boilerplate. There's a lot of, you end up writing a lot more code. And in some ways, yes, you will, but it's very straightforward, in my opinion. So you're adding like, it's a small trade-off for the benefits that you get in the long run, in my opinion. And with these factory functions, it makes that less of a I guess a headache. Like you limit the amount of code you're actually writing. So here, like instead of creating classes that implement that implement the action interface, you just create a constant that is equal to this function. And then you just pass in like the name of your action, and if an optional property that is needed to, to describe the state change you need, you just do it like this. So it's a lot less code that you end up writing. So then the other thing to know with actions is like, and this is not a big difference here, but like in version 7, you'd have to new up that, because actions were classes, you would have to new up these action classes everywhere. With version 8, they're just constant. So you just reference that constant. So you just dispatch that action like that. So it's essentially the same amount of codes. It's more just a subtle difference in how to do it. So here you would see like the way you would do it previously, and this is like, again, the standard like Redux way of doing it is you would have the reducers end up being like essentially switch statements that, based upon the action, it would then return a new instance of the state. So you can see like 31 lines of code to basically do like three actions here. So switch statement, different cases, and then returns a new example of that. So instead, create reducers narrows that down like to 20 lines. So instead, you have a create reducer function that it's again factory function. It returns a function. You pass in the initial state, and then it uses these ons, which is a something that gets imported from the NgRx store, and it is just essentially it's like using the case on the switch statement. So it's just like, in this instance of this action, this is how we want to, this is the state you want to return. It's for here and here and so forth. So, and then ultimately what you do is at the end, you just export this a reducer that you pass in the state and the action, and then you return this factory function here. Side effects, same thing. 23 lines to do like one effect, which basically I mentioned these are basically like services that you create. Previously, you had to decorate the service with an effect decorator, and then you would inject a stream of the actions stream into the constructor of your site, or of this effect, and then you would just pipe into that stream of actions and listen for actions of certain types, and then from there you would handle your side effect, like in this instance, like call a service that returns another observable that then you would then dispatch a success action or a failure action. The important thing to note with these effects are that they always return an observable of action. So these by default need to return another action on the other end of them. So here we are, 23 lines of code down to 14. So again, like this is fairly concise. I feel like it's not a lot of overhead. So again, same sort of thing. You no longer need, you're still using a service that gets injected with the actions stream, but you no longer need to decorate that service with a decorator. You just use these create effects factory functions, and then again listens for the type of action, and then you handle your side effect, call a service, then return success or failure based upon how that worked. So that's sort of like the difference between 7 and then I recommend if you guys are ever going to use it, NgRx is on 9 now, 10 I think, 9 or 10, and those creator functions will make your lives a lot easier. So the Redux DevTools, I mentioned earlier, you can import this as a config in your store module, and then it gives you some pretty awesome awesomeness. So essentially, this is like a tab in your Google Chrome developer tools that it's a log of all the actions that get dispatched in your application. And then it gives you, you can see the action itself, the state at the time, the difference, and then you can actually click on these actions, go forward, go back, and it gives you real-time debuggability in your app by default, which is a lifesaver the more and more you use it, and the more and more your applications grow. If a lot of people, like if you're a front-end person, a lot of times, you would just slap a console.log or something like that. Well, using NgRx and the Redux DevTools, you can really see, if you're using it, you see every action being dispatched, and you have a log of all the state changes. So you really don't need, to put logs in there like that. So it's pretty cool. So here's how you actually implement it. You install this store-devtools module from NgRx, and then basically inside of like your app module, inside of you import the store DevTools module, and then there are some configs in here. Oops. So you can put a max age is essentially, it defaults to 25. So it will keep a log of like how many actions that it wants to keep track of. Obviously, if you put like 500, it would probably lock up or something like that. Like you can only keep so many in that as the number that it keeps track of. But like 25, 50, like you don't want to have too many, because then it becomes also unhelpful. So that's nice that you can get that kind of customization. And then you can set, like, if you don't want the DevTools to show up in production or something like that, there's a flag here for that. The other thing to keep in mind, and I have an article I created about this, where I ran into an instance where, like, I had an application that every time like the user scrolled up or down, it would fire an action, like based upon where they were at in the app, like a certain part of the application would turn active or something like that. And so there would be all these actions being dispatched that were not super helpful. So it would just like flood my DevTools up. So you can actually blacklist certain actions in here. So you're like, I don't care about this action, it's not super helpful. You can add that as a customization to this as well. So here is like, I'm going to talk a little bit, and this one I talk best practices, like this is a little bit more like how to actually implement and the pattern that I recommend using, like the best way to organize. So essentially what we'll start off with is a root store module. So for anyone not familiar with Angular, when you create a new application, you're going to have a root module for your application. From there, we would then create a root store module that would be like the root module for your store. You would then import this in the app module, and then the root store would then contain an interface that basically describes the shape of the state of all the state in the store, and then selectors, which are selectors that want to select parts of the state from throughout the entirety of the site of the store. And then each one of and then you can create 4 feature modules that you import into the root store module. So you have like various features feature slices that you will import into this root store module. And then each one of those will contain its own instance of state, a state interface, their own actions, a reducer, effects, selectors, and so forth. So instead of like, I've seen a lot of people where they'll just throw everything in this one main store. It's much easier to separate these into feature stores, feature slices, and then one main root store that then has references to these and maybe some additional root state that you want as well. So here's how you would like install using @NgRx, and then you'd store DevTools and effects. We create a module for a root store. We'd import it into the app module. Then we create a root state interface. And for those of you not familiar, Angular has a CLI, and this is just some quick, I guess, commands to help generate some of this stuff. So here you'll see we have an app module. We're going to import a root store module that we just created, and then we want to add the store dev tool so that we get that real-time time traveling debuggability you get with the dev tools. Then we're going to create a feature state module, which we're going to create a module inside a root store called instrument store. I'm a musician, so I just thought of like something. So we're going to create a feature of instruments. So we're going to create an instrument store module and put it in the root, and we're going to import it in the root store module. And then we're going to create some actions. So we need an action that says, hey, we want to go load a request to get instruments. We then want to know if that request fails. And when it does, we want to catch any errors from that API. And if it's successful, we want to then basically store that list of instruments that comes back from that service. Then we will create an interface that describes the shape of that feature. We're going to put like an is loading Boolean flag, an error, and then a list of instruments. And then you then need to create an issue. Your store will need like an initial state because it uses copies of when you pass an action in, it needs the existing state to create a copy of it. So you need an initial state to initialize it. So here we're just setting is loading to false, error to null, and instruments to a list of, or an empty list. Then from here, we create a feature key, which is basically, it's just a string, but it essentially is used to sort of, it's kind of like a key that identifies the name of this feature in your store. We will then create a reducer, use a create reducer factory function. We pass in that initial state that we just created, and then we have on these ons, it's always funny to say ons, that then listen for these specific actions. So, so for the instance of, we want to make a load request, we want to create a copy of the initial state. Then we want to, when we want to go load the request, we want to tell the app that, hey, we're that it's loading. So we set that to true. And if we were making the request, it couldn't have failed yet, so we set that to null. Then we have, in the instance that we pass in a load success action, we want to, it takes in an optional, a property here of instruments that is a prop on the load success action that we previously created. Again, we're going to copy the state. We're going to set is loading to false, because if it came back successful, we know it's no longer loading. We know that there was no errors, so we set that to null. And then we want to update the list of instruments with the list of instruments coming back from the service. And then here, in the instance that it fails, we want to we pass in that error message prop that comes from this action. Create a copy of the state, set is loading to false because we're no longer loading, but we now have errors, and we pass it there. And again, we just return this function that returns this. Okay, so here we're going to create selectors, which I mentioned earlier. This is going to be a kind of trivial example, but it might give you an instance of what you can do. So here we create a feature, a create feature selector, which basically you pass in the state of it, the interface, and then you pass in that key that we described earlier, and then this becomes a it basically knows to select this part of the store. So then we create selectors that we can select parts of state in various parts anywhere in our application that we want to. So in this instance, we want to select error, because anytime that request errors, we want a way to like notify the user or something like that. So we use the create selector method or function, factory function, and then we pass in this select instrument feature state, which we created up here, and then we then just do state.error, because that is the error is the property on this instrument state interface that we created. And again, like is loading, same thing. We want to know when this is loading, because we'll probably have like a loader that turns on and off or spins or something like that. So this will then return that property. All these, again, these will return as observable. So this will be like an observable stream of errors, an observable stream of Boolean is loadings, and then as well as instruments. So here, this will select the instruments from that state. But you can do much more complex things. You could create a selector that takes in a property that then so you could have like, you could pass in a property from the specific user that's like, and then finds trombones or finds electric guitars or something like that, that are a certain color or something. So you can do a lot of logic that you would typically do in like a service or your component, and put these in these selectors, and then all of that gets pushed out of that business logic gets put in here, and it's easy to test and gets separated from the UI. And then here's an example of an effect. So we're in the instance, we're going to create an effect. We're going to, I mentioned earlier, it's a service here. We're going to inject a list, an observable list of actions. And then we're going to have an instrument service that makes a request to like an API that gets the list of instruments. So we inject that in here as well. We then create a load request effect. We pipe into this action stream. We then we only want to listen for when the load request action is dispatched. And in that instance, we want to do a switch map, which this is RxJS stuff, which is maybe it's a little bit more trickier for people who haven't used it, but there's a lot of resources online if you have questions with how to use it. But in this instance, essentially all it's doing is going to call the instrument service, get instruments. Which returns an observable of instruments. So then pipe into that stream, and then we dispatch a load success action, or if it fails, we then dispatch the load fail action with that error that comes back from that. So again, this gets pushed to the very edge of the application. We're not like injecting this effect anywhere in the site. It just gets provided in the module of the store. And then essentially all these side effects, your applications get pushed all the way to the edge, which is nice. So then these just dispatch their own set of actions based upon the side effect at hand. Oops. And here we go. Barrel rolls, which I know are sort of a controversial topic, but I think they make for a good use case in NgRx, or can. So because you're going to have, as your app grows, you're going to have lots of actions, lots of selectors, and those sorts of things. You can, I like to create index.ts files in those different parts of your application. So then you can import like all the actions, and then you import it and then re-export it. So that way you have like an easy way to reference all the action selectors and things like that in your site in your application as you use it more and more. So then now that we created a feature slice, we'll create the root states module, and look how we doing. I'm like 10-ish minutes, so wrap this up here quickly. So we have this interface for the root state module. We're describing the state. So essentially, we created a feature instrument feature slice. So we're going to put a property called instruments, and then it's going to be a type of the instrument state interface we created, and then we'll say we have some other feature that's going to be and so forth. You would have additional things as your application grows, and then as you can see, we need an initial state for that as well. And then we in the root store module, we then just import those various features. So we import the instrument store module, our other feature modules, and then we import the store module and the effects module. And then all we have to do is, so all these different features slices have their own module that can be separated out, that sort of thing. And then in our app module, we only import this module. So that way we're not doing all these, and we have this massive app module in our applications, which is a common thing I see a lot. So then what we can do is so now we have we created like selectors throughout the site. So here's another example of how you can compose custom selectors. So here, for instance, we have we want to create a selector so that any of our parts of our application that have an error though. So any service request or any side effect on our application that has an error, let's create one selector that catches any of those instances. Or let's create, so anytime any request is made, we want to toggle a loader. So you can actually pass in, use the create selector function, and then you actually pass in those selectors we already created. So you basically, you're composing a selector using other selectors, and then it just returns like any of them. So you would just have like a bunch of or statements. So it would turn like an empty string if there were no errors, or it would turn the first one in that list. So and again, you don't have to do this. The great thing is these selectors are memoized, so they're cached, so they're very quick, and you can do anything you possibly want, and they're just functions, so they're easy to test. And again, barrel roll, we then import these and export them. And then ultimately, here's how your components look. So instead of like previously, we would have to create like an instrument component, and then we would initialize this, and then we would like inject a service or multiple services or something like that. Well, ultimately, all you really need then is you only have this one dependency in all of your application, which makes so much nicer when you're writing tests and things like that. You just have one dependency on the store everywhere in your application. And then you can directly in the app, you just create properties. So this would be like an observable of instruments. And then you just select from that selector, the selector you created, use the select instruments selector. And then this now becomes an observable of instruments property inside this component that you can listen to any value changes. It doesn't care, your component doesn't care how it got it. It just knows that, hey, there's an observable of instruments and this is how I display it. And then you can dispatch actions. So like in the instance of when this component initializes, we want to dispatch this action to say, hey, go get, now that we have an instruments component initialized, let's go dispatch an action that gets the list of instruments from the API, and then it will then get picked up in this stream once they're available. And I mentioned earlier, depending upon your use case, you wouldn't even necessarily need an ng on init. You could get rid of that implementation altogether and just literally have one dependency on the store and the one selector of the thing you care about. Because if this was like, say on your application, the route was like /instruments, you could then create an effect that listens for, there's a module that ties into the Angular router, so you can dispatch actions based upon routes in your application. So if this was / a route that was /instruments, as soon as the router begins to navigate to that, it would then go make the request to get the instruments, put it in the store, and it could potentially even be available to you before you even got there. So it's a way to speed up performance and even make your components even quicker, or not quicker, but less code and even more pure by doing it that way. And then all you have to do then in the template of your application is literally like, you can do an ng-for, and we're going to iterate over this instruments. And then in Angular, they have an async pipe. So you can do instruments, like this is observable, so you can't actually reference, like it's not, you can't actually directly reference the instruments in the template like this. You would have to, like in the class, subscribe to it. Or here you can use this async pipe, which will essentially, it handles all that for you, and it handles the subscribing and the unsubscribing of those observables, so you don't have to worry about memory leaks in your application like this. So here you're just, you do instruments $async, and then we're iterating through each one, calling an instrument, and then we say we have a child component so for every instrument, we have an instrument component that we then just pass in that instrument into it. So again, our template becomes super clean. Our component class becomes very pure. And all of the parts of our application were very easily testable. And the side effects were pushed to the very far edge. So we completely separated all the business logic from the UI. So again, here's some takeaways. Make sure to use strict runtime checks. You probably won't run into them often, maybe more up front, but when you will be glad you have them in the instance that that you somehow something sneaks in. Recommend the root store module structure I showed by creating a root store module and then feature modules that get imported into that module. I suggest the REDUX DEVTOOLS because it gives you out of the box. If there's no other reason to use NgRx, just being able to have real-time debuggability in your application is a huge win. You can use that router store, like I mentioned, and that ties into, it's a module from NgRx that ties into the Angular router, and essentially you can dispatch actions based upon routes, query parameters, things like that. Some things to always remember. You want to think of actions as events, not commands. So with NgRx is basically, it's using RxJS, which is it's reactive programming. So instead of being very declarative, like do this, do that, think of actions as events that happen in your application, not necessarily the user does this. We need to know, like, okay, yeah, the user might click a button, but like, what is the action that actually happens? Like, we need an action that says we need to go get this data, or we need to do this or do that. So what are the events that take place in your application, and not just the commands that you need to take? So the other thing is avoid using anti-patterns. So like one thing that is easy to do that people sometimes I see a lot is reusing of actions. So it's best to have a unique action for every event in your application instead of reusing similar type of events with one action. You'll eventually, it may sound like a great idea up front, but eventually you'll kick yourself because you'll be like, here's this action, and how is this being dispatched? And it comes along, it was dispatched from some other part of your application that, some other developer on your team put in, or, you forgot about, or something like that. A lot of people use like facades, which some people you can use with NgRx, but I really feel like it's best to embrace the indirection of NgRx and leverage the things that it actually does best instead of using facades. And then use good action hygiene. So it's good to make sure that your actions are very readable and consistent across your application. And like I mentioned, leveraging NgRx indirection. So essentially, the data is always flowing one direction. So you always dispatch actions that go into reducers that then describe the way a new copy of that state should be composed, and then we get out an instance of that through selectors and subscribe to those as observables throughout our application. And then finally, make sure your everything, your selectors, reducers, and effects are very testable. They're pure functions. So as long as you get in the pattern of testing every time you create an action, you test you test that in your reducers. Every time you create a selector, make sure you write test to test that the state always is exactly the way you expect it, and effects. Once you do this, you have you'll feel very confident knowing that like all the business logic in your application is all tested and it's very pure, small, manageable way. Instead of like, it's very easy to just create like, big, massive methods that call other methods that have dependencies at different places. With here, it's a very clean, it's very opinionated, but very clean approach, pattern to this. So finally, it's about me. You can find me on Twitter at JordanPowell88. I have a little blog, JordanPowell.online. And anyone have any questions? Thank you guys for listening. Hopefully it's helpful.
I have a question. Okay. Yeah, the question I had was basically, you're going through like the example of the instruments, and you had some actions that were working off of it, like the loading and the success and the error.
Yes.
But and I'm guessing in that case you have known states you could describe there. Is that always going to be the use case? You know all the states, all the different actions that could happen potentially for this entity. I mean, what happens if you don't know some of the actions that might occur the thing you're trying to describe? Like, what happens if it's like an API and you have someone else implementing a component, but they didn't do it properly? So it's an action you don't recognize. Is that even possible? Is there something to handle like, I don't know. I haven't worked with this myself as a code base. I'm just wondering, like, thinking about like, you have 3 actions described for that one instrument earlier, if I remember correctly. But what happens if someone tries to describe, is it even possible to describe an action that's not set up, I guess? I don't know. Like, do you have to go back? Yeah,
I mean, someone could create an action, like just like, until you actually pass, like you put an instance of the action in the store and actually mutate. So like if you pass like, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but if you just pass like a bad action into a reducer, it will just return the existing state that it has as a copy. It'll just make a copy of the current, the initial state that's the previous state that's in the store. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but really like I guess like what instance would you not know what part of your app would do?
maybe it's like it's not your app. You're coming on board with a new team member. You're refactoring code and moving into the structure, but you maybe don't properly understand it, and so there could be actions that you're not anticipating.
Yes. No. Okay, that's a good question. So I'm contracting on a project right now that doesn't use NgRx, and it's a pretty big app that's shipped in like multiple languages all over the world, and they have these massive components, and it's and like I'm trying to slowly take parts of the application. Like I can't just rewrite the whole application. So it's like what I'm trying to do as I'm building features, feature work. I'm essentially the beauty of the feature slice architecture is that like you create the root store module, and then so right now you can't implement all the features, but you could just do one implementation of that. So in the example of the instruments, you would install NgRx, and then you would import that root store module into the app module of your app, and then you would then say, okay, let's create the instrument feature module, and you would say, okay, we know that this service, like, because in your example, like you could look at the instrument service and be like, okay, we're getting, there's a method that gets all the instruments. There's a method that deletes instruments or updates or whatever, whatever side effects are happening that will give some indication of the type of events that will happen in your application. But that would be a thing, is like, even if you don't know everything, like you can start somewhere, you know what I mean? Like you can start with what you do know, and then does that help like answer your question? And then like,
yeah, I just trying to paint a picture, like you said, if I was stepping into an application that doesn't have it, which I do have, we use just RxJS right now.
Yeah. So that's where like you can slowly start taking features, and you're like, okay, I know I need a list of all the instruments. So I'm going to put that in the store, and then there may be certain actions, but the big thing is like you could create these custom selectors for your specific instances and all these parts of your components that reference that. And then you'll slowly be like, oh, I really wish, like, I find, like, for instance, on the project I'm working, we have translations. So like we have like this translation service that's like everywhere in application, where it's like, if I could just slowly just get that alone out of into the store, I could get rid of a dependency throughout my entire application, because all I have to do is have a dependency on the store, and then I can then pipe into translations or, anywhere in the application I want. So that's a way, like, you can sort of like gradually step in. And I would say find places that are pain points that you like are hard to test, that you have a lot of dependencies or a lot of business logic, and just try to find like what are actions, like what are events that are like actually happening in the app.
I have a very similar question. Sorry for the noise. Where I have a giant app where the app is a website and has several sections, and kind of state gets loaded into kind of when you're in that sort of section, you want to kind of load that state. And does the root store module with the feature slices like in the app module still make sense if you have like an authenticated versus an unauthenticated, and then within the authenticated you have kind of like sections based on kind of like not just user role, but kind of functional user role?
Sure. So like, so you have like, say you have parts of your application that where state is available to some people and not others, is like that,
right?
Kind of what your example is. So yeah, I mean, the thing is like, either way, you're like, you would make a request to get data, right? So it's like, you could make the decision that says, I only want to go and get the data when I actually visit that part of the store. So even though, so say there's a private part of your site that's locked down to, if a user has like a subscription or like a paying customer or something like that, you could still create a feature module for that, and it would just be like empty state. So it's like, it's just there. But like once you get to the part of your application that already says, hey, like you're good, go get it. It's like, then it could then hydrate the store with that data.
And then you're only in the components themselves, or that like the sub module that's loaded there as part of some deep navigation. You'd only have you'd only be injecting or have the dependency of the store and doing dispatches and getting selectors. And okay, I get it.
Correct. So that's the thing is, to me, like a lot of people talk about like I would repeat code all day long if it eliminates dependencies, because I feel like dependencies are like, it's like the evilness of software. It's like, those are the things that cause the biggest pain, like pain points for developers. So it's like being able to have like one, though it's opinionated, so people don't like that, but it's like having an opinionated, very direct way of handling the flow of state in your application, and then just having one dependency throughout your whole app. Like, I think there's a lot of benefits to that. And then you also like, I found like without using NgRx, there's often like there's not easy way to solve like complex problems. I find like, so you end up just finding like, I just want to find one way to get this to solve this problem, where it's like, I find like with NgRx, you often, because you have the full, you have like the full capacity to any state of the application anywhere you want. So it's like, you think about how to solve problems differently versus like, I need to get this data here. So it's like, what's the easiest way to do it versus like, what's the best way to do it,
Oh yeah, I hear you. You have someone wrote a whole bunch of singleton services that are segmented in their modules, and you're like, wait, I want to reuse that, and like, I need that state in this other module, and like,
yep.
Actually, I'm in a really good point where I can actually think about using a state management and getting rid of that. So thanks for talking.
Yeah.
Answering John's question or Andy's question, because that was a question as well. I have another question. Kind of when I first got introduced to NgRx a couple of years ago, it looked
Mhm.
really complex. So I think it's
Sure.
been simplified. And I was wondering what your opinionated thoughts are on NgRx and NGSX, which looked like an easier way of implementing it, but it seems like they're kind of almost similar in the same, aside from the decorators.
Yeah. I would say I don't know a ton about. I'm familiar with it, but I've never used NG. Any of the other like uh, state management. There's Akita and NGXS and all this. I haven't used them enough to give like a valid argument for them either way. The big thing with NGRX, in my opinion, is that you get the selector, so you can literally create custom like derived state that has logic in it that your specific component way over here only cares about this two things of data that are completely unrelated. It's like being able like that would be very challenging to do in any other way. So that's the thing where it's like it's so easy just to be like, oh, let me just inject two services and then make two separate calls to get these things I care about. And then you're just making all these like requests for things that you don't necessarily need to, or it's like just being able to have one dependency and then just subscribing to those two things you want. And you always know that it's going to be up to date state. Like, I don't know. I think for me, it's just a very clean, like I feel confident knowing like it's, that it just works, I don't know if that helps answer your question or not, but yeah, I would say like, so I also like, I was super skeptical and like I was in that, I worked for an insurance company doing a lot of using a ton of forms, and there's like a lot of form logic, and so I thought like the majority of the state was contained in these forms. So I was like, I don't really feel like NGRX would provide a lot of benefit, but the more I started like doing a demo with it, I'm like, man, this actually could be super beneficial. And then like it like allowed me to really like rethink a lot of the ways I was doing things in the application, because it gives you like, it's like getting a whole new set of tools that you like would have would not even be available to you previously.
I have one
So
question.
is the store persistent, or can it incorporate persistent information from local storage or IndexedDB?
So yeah, you can hydrate it with like anything you want. I mean, like you could like, for instance, like you could have, like you said, local storage. Like if you had something stored in local storage, um, you would just like create, I don't know, like just offhand, you could create in a component that, you know, gets the item from local storage, and then you create an action that you dispatch that action into the store. So then that is now available throughout your entire application. And so you're not like, and then you could clear it from storage or something like that too. So there's an instance of like, I guess it's like, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that the big thing is like, it's just like a JSON object. So you can hydrate it really with like whatever you want, as long as your application has access to get the data.
So you do the persistence outside of the store itself?
Yeah, so you would get the data any way you want. The store doesn't care. It just knows how to manage the store you pass into it. And it keeps a reference of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I guess if you had a reducer and your initial state could be populated from local storage or some other persistence, but you'd be doing that as part of your initial state.
Do you have like a more specific like example you're thinking of?
I'm not sure I can articulate one, but it's more, well, okay, I'll put it for one application. It's a note-taking app, and it stores everything in IndexedDB. And I was wondering, so to retrieve that information from IndexedDB, would the store be doing it, or is this one of the other components outside the store?
So yes, it's just like a wrapper on Angular. So you would have to be using Angular. That's the one thing. But if you're, however you reference, like how do you reference that data currently? Is it in a component, in a service, something like that?
Well, it's not in Angular.
Okay. So let's just say like you had a service that went and fetched instruments or something. Like it's like in that example, you dispatch an action that says, hey, I need that in those instruments. The store doesn't care. It just knows that like when I pass that request, it changes the Boolean flag that says, hey, I'm now loading. And then that effect listens for that action, then just calls that service. The store doesn't care where the state comes from. It just knows that given the state, this is exactly how I need to manage it. So you could have that service call, get the data from IndexedDB, from a cache, from an API. Like it doesn't really care how it gets.
So the store itself is just holding
JSON
data equivalent to JSON data?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So it doesn't care where it gets the data from. It just knows how to manage the state in your application.
So
you're
if
not
you have
tied to
a blob could not be stored in the store itself.
Correct, because blob it can't be serialized, can it?
Well,
I don't think so.
It can be copied with the JavaScript clone algorithm, so that the structured clone algorithm can copy a bunch of things that don't fit into JSON. So
I'm not sure that specific instance, but yeah, essentially you could yeah, you would have to find a way to as long as it can be serialized, you can put it in the store.
And you know, the people are doing things with persistence with Redux, and obviously probably with NgRx, because you can, you know, you have that snapshot capability where you can, you know, there's applications where you can replay or libraries you can replay the state. So you can, you know, in some cases, you know, get the state or send the state off to CouchDB or IndexedDB, and then or merge it together if you want to have fun with what are those data types called? Conflict free, whatever.
Yeah.
CRDTs. Conflict free replicatable data types.
Yeah, so ultimately it doesn't care where you get the data. It just knows how to store it as long as it's persistent. And so it really just puts like all the parts in your application in like their own little bucket, and they all know how to communicate with each other, and they don't care about what any other part does. They're just like, I know how to do my piece.
Hey, John, your audio is not working.
Very garbled.
Yeah, it's very quiet and underwater.
1x5 or 5x1, something like that.
It's interesting because you were fine earlier, and then when you asked your previous question, you were quiet, but we could make it out. But this time, it's like it's progressing towards worse. So, I don't know. Maybe a battery's dying. I'm going to take that to be, yeah, that could be. You can go ahead and drop your question in chat if you want, Andy.
I had a question meanwhile, you know, at the risk of asking third time around the same question, and maybe that's because I have never worked with this. So when I look, what I hear from your presentation is that the NgRx has some sense of global scope. So is there some way to enforce encapsulation where not everyone's hand is in the same cookie jar, and you know, all of a sudden say all your instruments are gone and you don't quite know who did it?
Yes. Yes. So there is a new module with NgRx called Component Store, which I didn't get into, but that essentially doesn't take the approach of a global store that anyone can touch, because that approach is like it's the approach of like, I don't really care who did it. It's just like, I just keep track of state for everything, and anyone can access it. So like there's benefits, and obviously there's drawbacks to that. There is an implementation that just got released in the most recent version of NgRx, which I'll put a link to that in the docs. And that is more specifically to like local state of a specific component. So it gives you some of the benefits of some of the indirection and the things I talked about, but it's more isolated to a specific component. So that might be kind of what you're thinking. So it can be very helpful, the component store. I have concerns that a lot of people will use the component store and try to make it like the global store, and vice versa, I guess. But there is that way of handling it too. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
I mean, if state is like localized a component, like I don't know if I understand. I'll have to read that documentation, but like, you know, when you're using Redux or whatever, one of the reasons not to use Redux, if you just have a component or its immediate children and state's just affected there, and you're, you know, like you're just doing like toggling or whatever, or just, yeah, state's very localized. You really don't need that big of a state management as long as pure
it's
function.
kind of, if you guys are familiar with like a service with a subject, like RxJS, like a service with a subject, it's kind of NgRx's way of kind of doing that. It's kind of like an alternative approach to it. I've seen some pretty cool demos of good use cases, and actually on the site there is a breakdown of like when's a good use case to use one versus the other. So it might give a better example of it, but I think the use cases for using component store are going to be a lot smaller than like a global store. The big thing with the global store is like, as your application grows and requirements change, you have a lot more flexibility to adapt to those changes versus like being tied to other decisions that have been made in your app, previously.
I think you shouldn't really worry about global state, since you should be using reducers and only getting what you need, from your selector, and affecting that. So if you have this giant, you don't really necessarily have this giant store that's all mutable. You're really looking at slices of specific parts of that global storage.
Correct.
Or store.
And that's the big thing is like, if you're typically, those features are going to somewhat line up with the features of your application. So like typically, if there is a mistake or you're not sure why there's a problem where state isn't there or something like that, typically it's going to be referenced from that same general area in your site, because it should be somewhat logical that it would be in the same feature slice.
But I mean, if you rely on all the other reducers behaving right, sort of the state that matters locally for your modularity for just one component is dependent on the fact that everyone else is behaving, as opposed to, in some way making it private. And as long as you mark your territory, you're not dependent on having a bug somewhere else. There's a difference, right?
Correct. So, I mean, if you have state that only one component cares about, and I guess it depends upon your use case. It's like if there's a state that only this component uses and it has no dependencies upon something else, it's like there wouldn't really be any value to put that in the store. The big thing is that like is in your instance of say you have this component and it's the only component in your application that goes and makes requests to get data or something like that. Like, well, that may be the case today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the case tomorrow, that, you know, there's not another part of your application that cares about that. So there is obviously, like anything, there are some, you have to be careful with global state, but the big thing is like, if you're testing all the actions in your reducers and how they affect change, and you're not reusing actions, which I mentioned, so you shouldn't run into this thing where state is being is being changed throughout your application if you're not reusing actions, because well, those actions, you know, shouldn't be reused. So does that help, Davey?
Yeah. So can different actions affect the same state, or
Yes,
they can?
So that's the thing. So and it's probably a good example is like, so for instruments, so for the instruments example, say there's 5 different parts of your application that need to make a new request to get list of instruments. It would be good hygiene to create 5 actions that affect the state the exact same way, because then you can track down where that call is being made, and you know exactly, you can test that every single one of them affects the state the same way, and that you know where it came from. So that's why reusing actions, people do it because they're like, oh, I don't need to test the same thing again because, you know, it works and I'll just reuse this action. But then you run into that where you have, you know, you just keep adding places in your app that that do that, and then you know, you sort of go down that rabbit hole.
I think if we all have questions about, you know, Redux and state management, you know, following Abramov or however whatever his name is pronounced, and watching some of his talks, because he does a really good job of explaining things, just in general, not Angular based, you know, React, Angular, whatever.
Absolutely. And if any of you guys have specific implementation questions, or you come up with something, feel free to DM me on Twitter or something, and I'd be happy to help in any way I can.
Excellent. Well, that sounds like the breaking point, doesn't it?
What's happening next month?
So I don't have it up on the ColumbusJS site yet, but I was just going to say, well, I was going to say first, let's give Jordan a big virtual round of applause for a great talk. I was busy doing social media stuff around it, so it's always hard to kind of focus on the talk when you're the MC. But it sounded like you were doing great.
That's all that matters, right?
Well, I mean, you got a lot of questions, and that's always a fantastic sign. So, and it, you know, and we're still streaming, so it's great. But yeah, so again, thanks very much for joining us tonight, Jordan. Hopefully you can come and hang out with us on regularly on our monthly meeting, which I am planning on turning fortnightly. Now, I don't know exactly, I haven't figured out all the details yet. I'm meeting with some other meetups. We're going to try and maybe do like a federated meetup where some meetups share audiences. So that's a thing that's in the works. I'm literally meeting tomorrow to talk about, you know, to take the first steps in that process. But next month, I've got on the docket, I talked several months ago, and I need to follow up, Santosh Yadav, who would be joining us all the way from Pune, India. And he's got awesome. An Angular talk he'd like to give. So that actually feels like that segues nicely with what we did, because, you know, this is NgRx, but just a straight up Angular talk to complement that, I think it would be really nice. And so that's on November 18th, or I'm sorry, on October 21st. On November 18th, Jenna Charlton is going to join us from Cleveland, Ohio. She writes a lot of testing oriented talks. And so it's going to be agile testing basics for non-testers. So it's going to be slightly not JavaScript, but it's general developer kind of a topic. And in December, I've got TJ Van Tol from Lansing, Michigan scheduled, but I don't know that I have a title for him.
Wow, we have a December talk.
Yeah, well, it's on the 16th, so it's not too bad. Actually, you know, I may cancel that one because December 16th is my anniversary.
Yeah.
But usually we have the holiday party.
Yeah, but that, you know, I don't think that's going to happen this year.
There is that.
And honestly, you know, so our anniversary is December 16th, and so I probably shouldn't be doing hosting a talk there, but I could always get one of you all to be MC as well. I know Doug is always very regularly here, and he's you know, he's sort of an honorary I mean, he's hosted many times when I was traveling. And Matthew, I think you're here. You're always here. You're often joining the Zoom before I do. So I think I could trust either one of you to host the event if I want to do something. So yeah, I think, and I need to reach out to these people just to make sure that it's still happening. Make sure they're aware of this. I've been kind of busy and it's been hard to keep up with all this stuff. And depending on the schedule change and stuff, I've got some other people lined up. So that's what's coming up for the next quarter, roughly. We have another Angular talk, a Agile testing talk, and something from Lansing, Michigan. So yeah. So well, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the streaming now. So Horseshack Test gave applause from Twitch. Thank you very much. So I posted into the chat here the Twitch address and the Discord address. So please give us a join and a follow on the Discord and on the Twitch respectively. And just to help grow those communities. And yeah, so thanks a lot everyone for coming out tonight. And I'm going to turn off the stream. The rest of us here on Zoom, we can hang out as long as we like. You know, I'm not going anywhere. So if you want to chit chat and talk about other related topics, feel free. Those who are watching on Zoom or on Twitch, this is an incentive to watch us, to join us on the Zoom, is we get to hang out afterwards and chit chat. So thanks a lot, everyone. And let's kill the stream.